Okay, now I want to spend a little time talking about just some more details about the Paleolithic era, because it's important that in order to fully understand the significance of the Neolithic Revolution, you need to know what came before it so you can really appreciate the change that occurred. So we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about some key characteristics of this era. So they were hunter-gatherers, first and foremost. So they moved around from place to place in search of food. They hunted game, and they also gathered berries and plants and little things that they could use to feed themselves. They lived in very small groups, roughly about 20 to 30 people, close as we can figure. And they had gender-based definitions of labor, which meant that based on the physical characteristics of male and female members of the community, this is how they divided their labor. So men generally hunted and women generally gathered. That's just an example of how the divisions of labor worked out. There are others as well. They were nomadic. Okay, and nomadic means that they're not stationary in one permanent settlement. They move around from place to place in search of food. Okay, so it's important to keep that in mind. And they follow game and ripening fruit, as I basically just said. They developed simple tools that were built from stone, wood, or even bone. Generally, they were animal bones of the game that they hunted and killed. They also invented clothing, so this is important to protect us from the elements. We needed to have some form of outerwear so that we could successfully navigate the changing weather. There were also cave paintings, and we do see evidence of religious rituals based on ancient burial sites. And even though there's no written language or any written detail of how these ceremonies transpired, we do see archaeological evidence of such rituals. So that tells us that humanity is beginning to advance at this point. We're beginning to really distinguish ourselves from other species on the planet. Now, the Neolithic period, this is where things get fun. This is where the big, AR, the agricultural revolution happens, right? So it was approximately 10,000 years ago, they began to farm, right? So roughly 10,000 years ago, because remember 8,000 BCE on the number line, we're at, 2018, so that's 2,000 years past zero, and if you backtrack, that gets us to 8,000 BCE, right? Okay, so life became more sedentary, permanent villages developed, obviously, we talked about that. We have some seed planting, we have animal domestication. The seed planting is obviously necessary to cultivate plants and control how much you grow and make sure that you have enough to sustain your population. We became food producers as opposed to food followers, okay, and that helped us to a much greater extent control our lives and allowed us to advance. Farming led to a massive growth in population because there was a sustainable food supply. And when you have a guaranteed, or rather, sustainable is probably the best word, a sustainable food supply, you're able to nourish your society and also plan ahead. You can think ahead, and things just tend to be much better when you have that sustainable, consistent food supply that they did not have as hunter-gatherers. All right, so some other characteristics of the Neolithic era. You have councils of elders that begin making decisions. So you see the beginnings of politics, the beginnings of political organization. How exciting, right? And as you'll see when we get into the early human real civilizations, you'll notice that a lot of the building blocks that are necessary for the requirements to have a civilization, you see the building blocks here, such as the development of a rudimentary political organization. Individuals started to accumulate more personal property, because when you're nomadic, you're really not, whatever you have to be able to carry it and follow, your tribe. So you're not carrying like a big plasma TV. I mean, they had plasma TVs then, but you know what I mean. If it's really heavy, you're going to leave it if it's not absolutely necessary. So now you get to accumulate more stuff because you don't have to move it around with you because you got one spot to be. It's a permanent spot. We do see that there's some sort of timekeeping, a type of calendar to record when, for example, when the best planting seasons were, to try to keep track of the weather to a certain extent. We also start to see the development of animals in field work to help us plow the fields instead of us sitting there with like hoes and rakes and shovels and stuff. Now we're using animals which are much stronger to pull a plow, and that allows us to be more efficient in our farming. And this of course, led to the emergence of civilizations. Okay, innovation and cultural diffusion. When one innovates, that allows us to create something that didn't already exist that we need to currently function, right? So it's very, very important, innovation. So now what is cultural diffusion? Well, I have a little definition for you here. It is the idea that the cultural beliefs and social activities are spread through different ethnicities, religions, nationalities, etc. Okay, so once you have a permanent settlement, okay, and when various different tribes start doing this, then you start to see more extensive interactions between societies. Okay, you start to see things like trade happening, and that's when one tribe has a certain set of cultural values and another tribe has another. Well, they may share, they may pit one or place one against the other, there might be a war, but either way, when you have the spread of a certain culture, that's basically what diffusion is. It's the spreading out of one's culture. Okay, so as societies increased the domestication of animals, techniques were borrowed and handed on. So what one tribe perhaps did very well, they maybe one aspect they were good at, another they weren't, they could potentially find another tribe that was the opposite. That other tribe was good at what they were bad at and was bad at what they were good at, and then they could exchange that knowledge and both do well. The benefits of trade, it's good times. We'll learn about that later on in the year. Seeds and crops were also exchanged, so this also increased what was grown and what was traded. So this idea of a more extensive human interaction also gave rise to future civilizations. So what were the agricultural advantages, right? So we had a surplus of food because we had this dependable supply. So when we had this extra food, now we need to think about, well, what do we do with all this extra food? Well, we need to figure out how to preserve it. And that's when these very simple preservation techniques, such as drying things out, salting meat, and turning it into jerky, something that was more, that would last longer. Figuring out how to preserve surplus food became very important, and we developed a lot of very useful techniques for that. Since we had a more dependable supply, that allowed us to increase our population. Yay, good times, yayness. Now with population growth, now we have to figure out how to organize ourselves in a much more specific way. So we have this thing called social stratification. And as homework, you're going to look up that word, stratification. Go look that up. You're going to write it in your notes. As societies became more sedentary, that means you just kind of stay. You sit. You're not moving about like I'm sedentary, I'm just hanging out. Now clearly you can see throughout this lesson, like I'm Italian, I have to talk with my hands, like I can't help myself. So I'm definitely the opposite of sedentary. So with this specialization of labor and private property, now these things are in fact natural results of settled lifestyles. Okay, the idea that once you're in one spot and you don't have to worry about, well, I don't have to find food. I don't need to build into my day. I must spend several hours hunting a deer. I must spend several hours finding these berries and collecting. No, because you have a farm outside. So now you have time to think about other things like, oh, what might be really good? I might want this piece of property because that's good farmland that I can grow things on, right? And I'm particularly good at the seeding part of farming, but I'm not so good at the harvesting. So maybe I'll focus my time on putting the seeds in, and then somebody else is really good at harvesting. They can come in and do that. That's where we get specialization of labor and private property, okay? Now the specialization of labor also led to more complex and hierarchical, that's another word, we need to go look that up, hierarchical, look that up, write in your notes, check them for that. Social structure, so certain things in society were considered more important than other things. And that, how you decide what's important, what's more important, what's less important, is actually comes directly from cultural values, which was what makes cultural diffusion so important. All right, so civilizations, basics. We're nearing the end here, so hang in there with me, folks. So agriculture required greater effort and organization, so you see the development of long-lasting structures, okay, long-lasting settlements, which necessitates structures. So these early societies eventually grew into civilizations. What are the key components of civilizations? So, well, before we get to that, what factors do you need to have that happen? You need a permanence of population, you need agricultural stability, and you need innovation. Okay, without those three things, no civilization, okay? So you could turn this into like a little equation. So population permanence, agricultural stability, innovation, put a plus sign between each of them, equals civilization, right? Good times. So cities grew out of cultural sophistication and social complexity. Cities are a key component of a civilization, right? A city is more than a large group of people living together, right? It's much more than that. There's a lot of factors, okay? They have specialized workers and artisans. They have complex institutions like political systems, religious systems, social structures, like social classes, right? Some people become responsible for record keeping. Civilization, written language, woo! That's a key feature of actual history. They must have a written language. Okay, that's what prehistory versus history. Prehistory, no written language. History, written, documented, yayness, okay? And technological innovations, okay? These things are particular to a city. That's what makes a city unique. So, cities offered for its residents protection and defense. You could trade and engage in economic activity that was profitable and beneficial to you. There were the centers of political leadership, all right, so that's what governed your society. And you allowed for the exchange of ideas, information, values, and religious beliefs. Very, very important. All right, so this is just like a big picture map of ancient human civilizations at this time, okay, in the very early stages of human civilization. So you see Sumer is over here, well, the earliest civilization. We have Egypt over there. This is in the Indus Valley. You're seeing some Indian, Eurasian populations. Over here is ancient China, okay, and now Europe didn't exist as we think it existed at the time, you know, as we know it today. But just to give you a sense of geography, if Europe is here, if you go south of Europe, that's really where you see the birth of civilization, okay? And then Asia is just north of the Indus Valley. So just to give you a visual of where these things were in relation to each other. And that ends our presentation. So our next presentation, our next video lesson will be about Mesopotamia, which arguably is the birth of human civilization. So I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you next time.